Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the third in our series of lectures which are a journey through Scotland's past. So this is a series of lectures hosted by Historic Environment Scotland as part of the Year of History, Heritage and Archaeology, the intention of which is to show off the expertise of our fantastic staff. So this evening, I'm pleased to say that I've got three of my very, very best friends here to speak to you. So you may not be aware, but we have two archaeology teams working within Historic Environment Scotland, one of which focuses entirely on the properties in care. So that's that fantastic wall of sites, which includes sites like Edinburgh Castle and Stirling Castle, which you'll all be very familiar with. And another team, which I'm now part of, which looks after the archaeology grants and provides grants to archaeological projects around Scotland. Sorry, I should introduce myself at that point. My name is Dr. Kirsty Owen, and I am Senior Archaeology Manager at Historic Environment Scotland. So, just returning to this evening's schedule, first up this evening we will have Dr. Lisa Brown. Dr. Lisa Brown is an Archaeology Manager in the Archaeology and World Heritage team. She's got extensive archaeological field experience, including a decade of excavation in Italy. She's been active in archaeology for the last 15 years and has worked for the National Museums of Scotland and as a freelance archaeologist before starting as archaeology manager for HES 4 years ago. She's something of a jack of all trades and has a PhD in coins and Roman burials in Italy, Germany, Denmark and the UK, and has worked on field work in the Scottish Iron Age and still currently does so alongside of her day job. In addition, we have Rachel Pickering and Steve Farrer. Rachel Pickering is an archaeologist in our Cultural and Natural Resources team, so that's the archaeology team which focuses exclusively on the estate of properties in care. She is responsible for providing archaeological and historical advice on the sites, which includes commissioning research, providing advice on archaeological matters, and also contributing to interpretation projects, which is where Steve comes in. And Steve is an interpretation officer working on the properties in care, a former newspaper journalist. He now works on providing stories which share information about our archaeological and historical sites across Scotland. He's passionate about history and archaeology and has worked on major reinterpretation projects at some fantastic sites such as Edinburgh Castle and Edinburgh Castle. So that's enough of me talking. I think at this point I'd like to introduce Dr. Lisa Brown.
I've been pre-warned that this is moving a little bit slow this evening, so you'll have to bear with the technology slightly, but I just want to extend my personal welcome to you all. As Kirsty said, I'm Lisa Brown and I work for Archaeology and World Heritage in Historic Environment Scotland. I just wanted to begin this evening with, before we launch into the main course, with a brief introduction to the Iron Age in Scotland. So I want to give you an idea of when in prehistory we're talking about when we refer to the Iron Age, but also the different types of architecture and artifacts that you might expect to see. So to help you orientate yourself chronologically, what we have here is the dates of the Iron Age as given by the Scottish Archaeological Research Framework, or something which is called SCAR for short, which places the Iron Age in around 800 BC to AD 400, or possibly up to AD 500 if you take into consideration the arrival of Christianity. While I'm mentioning SCARF, I'm going to give them a little bit of a plug. So this is their web address. So if any of you are really interested in this framework, which covers all periods of Scottish prehistory and history, it's worth having a look and you should hopefully learn something about it. And also it's the framework that's guiding research in Scotland at the moment, so it should help give you some of the context to all the different talks that you're hearing throughout the year. So sometimes you'll hear the term Long Iron Age, which extends this period up to around AD 800 and 900. When using this chronology, it's usual that you would subdivide it into the early, middle and late Iron Age. And I've put up on the screen here the dates for the breakdown of that period as given by Mike Perkle-Pearson and Neil Sharples back in 1999. So both of these talks that you're going to hear today, entirely by coincidence, are on the built architecture of the Iron Age, but there are a range of different domestic and ritual buildings together with associated activity which date to this period. So to give you a bit of a flavour, I just wanted to highlight three very different types. Oh, there's my map. It's just in the wrong order. As is usual at such things. Apologies for that. So there you go, a little bit easier. You have Clickhimin Broch up here, Bruachatua in here, my pasture cave distant sky, Burney up in Murray, and Blacklock-Merton way down here. So you're getting a nice little range of sites. So what we'll do is, while that's loading, I'll take you on to your first site. So this site is Burney, so it's up in the northeast of Scotland. It's just outside of Elgin in Murray, and has been excavated by the National Museums of Scotland. It's a multi-period site with evidence for up to 19 roundhouses. Now those are just single structure. Many of those roundhouses have been taken down, have been rebuilt. So if you're talking about all the rebuilding phases, there's about 30 houses that's on this site. So it's quite an extensive Iron Age settlement. It also has evidence for metalworking, which all dates to the Iron Age. The clearest feature of these is this erosion hollow, which hopefully you can just see around here. And it's often called a ring ditch. So if you hear of a ring ditch house, that's the kind of structure that we're talking about. And there are many different explanations for the cause of this erosion hollow, which is then filled with the darker soil there. And my favourite is that the cows were brought into your house in the winter. The cows lived in part of your house, and they're wandering around, created this erosion hollow. So that's my favourite. So these buildings here, they're quite massive. You can see the people here. They're roughly 19 metres in diameter. They have an inner ring of posts, which goes around here, and an outer ring of posts here, which helps to hold up the roof and also some upper floors. So this site here is almost unique because of the preservation of these. I don't know if you can see them very well. And what these are timbers which either held up the upper floor or the roof. And these are being preserved as charcoal because the house was burned down. And so we can tell a lot about the construction of these buildings. And I'm quite conscious we have an expert in the audience in Tanya Romankovic, so I'm going to say no more than that. But you get things surviving like this here, joint. And these things are 2,000 years old. And here we have a joint. There's lots of different finds from this site. The most kind of interesting, I find, there are 2 Roman coin hoards, which show that the Iron Age people are interacting with the Roman people at this time, and also this beautiful enameled bird mount. Now this is really tiny, it's like that size. So the second site that I'm going to have a look at is Blacklock-Merton. Now this is the one that's located down in Dumfries and Galloway, and is currently being excavated by AOC Archaeology. So this is an Iron Age wetland village. It comprises multiple roundhouses which were situated directly onto the peat. These position in a waterlogged environment has led to quite spectacular preservation, as you can see, of the structural remains, which is completely unique in Scotland. In this image here, you can see so in this one here, if you look, you can see there's posts and things that are going to be around here. You also have the floor material, which you can see here. Lots of evidence of almost of internal construction here. So there's quite a lot of information that we can gain from these. We know from the preservation of sites such as this, what we're getting a nuanced understanding of how these buildings were constructed, the materials that they used to build these or to make the flooring. And we also know that how space was divided within the structure and how different parts were used for different activities. So the archaeologists who are looking at this site at the moment are investigating the possibility of seasonal occupation of this site. And the idea that the cattle, again, may have been stabled inside the houses. And you can tell this through the pollen evidence and also through the insects which are surviving within this. I was very lucky enough to dig this site, and what there was loads of insects. You would pick up a piece of the flooring and it would just be filled with insects that are 2,000 years old. They look like they were put there yesterday. It's really quite spectacular. And what you see in this image here is actually a quite huge entranceway. This is where a porch, and you can see where the big timbers would have put in for the construction of this porch. So finds from this site are limited, although there are quernstones, there's an iron share which is part of an ard, there are quartz pebbles, and the really nice spindle whorl which you can see in the bottom corner. So to give you a third, other completely different site, I want to move to High Pasture Cave in Skye. So this is another multi-period site. It was excavated by the archaeologists Stephen Birch and Martin Wildgoose, together with students and also a lot of local volunteers who helped out on the site. Activity on this site spans almost 6,000 years. It dates from the Mesolithic through to the post-medieval period. The majority of the activity from the site dates to between the Late Bronze Age and throughout the Iron Age. And this is a ritual site, so this is completely different again. Access to the cave during this period was modified, so you can see bits of the access here, and you can see this person down here, so you get an idea of scale. And there was lots of buildings that were built outside on the precinct, and there were walkways that were added into the cave itself. Finds from this site include a large number of animal bone, so it suggests that there's a lot of feasting going on at this time. And also you've got metalworking debris such as slag and crucibles. But perhaps most spectacular, it doesn't look it, but it is this thing here. So for those of you who haven't come across this before, this is a bridge from a lyre. So it is dates roughly to around the 4th century BC, and actually is the oldest evidence for a stringed instrument in the Western Isles in Europe. So we've got quite a spectacular archaeology of the Iron Age in Scotland, and I'm quite proud to say that all of these projects that I presented are funded through the archaeology programme at Historic Environment Scotland, and then part funded by the organisations and people that I've mentioned. So there are many other different types of structure. I just don't have time to go into here. There's hill forts and crannogs and everything else, but I just wanted to give you a bit of a flavour. So finds from Iron Age sites can be really quite varied. I mentioned a few here, but I just wanted to give you a few more examples. The quernstones and the pottery, which should hopefully come out. You can see, oh, there you go. So your quernstone and you've got your pottery down here. So what these can tell us are a lot about agriculture and about diet. And you've got these pins here, and this armlet, beautiful armlet from Culbin Sands, which can help us to understand dress, to understand display of status. We can start to reconstruct social dynamics and get an idea of art and ideology just from these few objects. Metalworking debris, which is the rather spectacular piece of iron slag here, we can get an idea about industry and about craft. And also, one of my personal favourites is this perforated human skull. So we can start to get an idea of what is going on with regards to ritual behaviour. So that was a very, very brief introduction to the Iron Age, and I'm happy if you have any other questions, either during refreshments or during the Q&A. But hopefully it's given you an idea of when in history we're talking about, but also the finds and buildings that you might encounter. So I'm going to move on now to continue to talk about a project I've been working on for the last few years, bringing to publication a incomplete archive project, which is shedding light on an Iron Age community in the Western Isles. And after that, I'm going to hand over to my colleagues, Rachel and Steve, who will be giving you a glimpse into the work of interpretation. So how do we present very complex archaeology out to the public? Before I start, I just want to extend a quick apology to any Gaelic speakers in the audience. It is a language that I'm trying desperately to learn. It's going okay, but I've been told by a native speaker that I actually pronounce Gaelic like it's Latin. I'm pretty certain that he didn't mean that as a compliment. So we'll just have to bear with me. So this project here was part funded by the Historic Environment Archaeology Programme and also part funded by the National Museums of Scotland. And the aim was to bring together a very dispersed archive and to make public the results of this excavation. Our further aim was also to look at the potential of information which is locked up in these older projects, what we refer to as legacy projects. And I'm continuing to look at further work in this area. So I'm going to start talking because that should hopefully come out. So the site of Bruachatua is located on the north side of the airfield in Ballyvanich in Benbecula in the Western Isles, which is an island located between north and southwest, just off the northwest coast of Scotland. Hey, works. So here's your site out here. This is Benbecula. And for those of you who may be lucky enough to have flown into the airport, that's it there. Usually when I fly in, I've got my face stuck right up against the window to try and see if I can see the site. And actually, I was very lucky to see it the last time I was there. So for the Compton Mackenzie fans in the audience, well, you may be interested in BBC News that they're actually remaking Whiskey Galore, but also you may have noticed that this lecture is a play on the novels, the titles of the novels, Rockets Galore and Whiskey Galore, because this site was investigated as part of the Ministry of Defence rescue excavations, which were undertaken in 56 and 57 in advance of the construction of the Ministry of Defence rocket range in the US. So these investigations remain to this day one of the largest scale rescue excavations that have been undertaken in Scotland. Survey and or excavation was undertaken over all the sites, all the archaeological sites, which would be possibly damaged or destroyed by the construction of this rocket range. This was done on behalf of the then Ministry of Public Buildings and Works, which is a predecessor body to Historic Scotland, and actually also many of the other national agencies such as CADU and what is now Historic England. So those archaeological sites that were most risk of destruction were targeted for excavation, and Bruachatua is one that fell into this category. So the site itself comprised at least 2 Iron Age wheel houses, a souterrain, which is an underground storage area, and also a small circular structure which was located to the south. For those of you not familiar with wheel houses, I'm going to get this timing right eventually, there are fairly common Iron Age dwellings that can be found throughout this area. They are roughly circular structures, a few examples up here, with an open central area. So kind of open in here, and then the space around this is divided up into what are known as bays by internal walls. You can see them coming out here. And what these do, this is actually a slightly better example here, and so what these do is, if you're looking down on it from above, it looks like a wheel. So that's where it gets its name from. They can come also with additional cells, which you'll see in one of the examples that I'm going to be talking about today. And they're typically constructed by digging a pit into the macker and then lining that with the stones. So it's slightly subterranean. So 2 separate excavations were undertaken at this site, each focused on a different part of the site. James C. Wallace was the first to excavate. He excavated between the 27th of July and the 7th of August 1956. He was closely followed by Jack G. Scott, who excavated between the 22nd and the 31st of August 1956. As far as we understand it from the correspondence files, it looks like these 2 excavators never overlapped, nor do we have any evidence they actually even spoke to each other. So it's been really interesting. There was a lot of confusion in early studies because he thought there was just a single site that both gentlemen excavated, but in fact not. They excavated 2 very connected but different sites. So in the 50 years since the excavation, the archive for the site has become quite dispersed, with the artefacts and the paper archive finding its way into the collections of the National Museums of Scotland, to Historic Environment Scotland, also to Kelvingrove Museum, and also the National Archives of Scotland. So it's a bit all over the place, but we have now brought it together. There may also be material from another mound on the site, which is known as Bruach Moor, which was deposited in Cambridge. So the archive itself, I've just given you a few examples up here. It comprised the funds, which were split between 2 different museums. We had a single plan that gave you the post-excavation. So after all the excavation had finished, they excavated you a plan of one of the wheel houses that's on the site. We have a plan that was drawn in the middle of the excavations, roughly, of another part of the site. We also have a section drawing, which is this here, which thankfully goes through both of the sites. So this stuff here relates to one excavation, and this stuff up here relates to other part of the excavation. So it was a bit of a jigsaw puzzle when it came to working with that. But using this, it was possible to start to reconstruct the methodology of excavation and all the features and the finds that were found within each of the structures. So I'm going to start and discuss the wheel houses separately so that you get an idea of what was found where, because they're very different types of survival. So hopefully, as the cogs go, this is Bruachatua, and we've referred to it as number 1. Here you can see this is wheel house number 2, so we know they were open together because we have this little image up here, and this here is Bruachatua number 1. I mentioned to you the souterrain, so just so you help you orientate it, that's that there. And also a structure to the south, that is that there. So this one didn't have a great level of survival, with the stones of the outer wall about 1 to 3 courses high, and actually only 1 stone wide. During excavation, from a report that we have, it noted that the walls itself were leaning outwards, so this would suggest it was a pit dug into the sand and then lined with these stones. We think that the reason for the survival at this level was bulldozing activity, which took place during the construction of the airport runways in the 1940s. And we know that the bulldozers moved south to north, which we think is why there is less kind of here, more up here. So we think it's probably with the bulldozing and the pushing of all of the sand and other debris, we think it may have protected this slightly. I'm not sure, but we think that might be one of the cases. What is really interesting, however, is that there is here a lack of stones entirely. Now we could possibly say this was to do with the bulldozing. It pulled away these stones, but what we do have, and hopefully once it comes to my plan, is you can see that it's actually a hearth on the line where the stones were. So as it pops through, there is a hearth here. So it looks like that actually the stones there may have been purposefully removed, possibly in a later period. The outer wall of these stones of this house suggests that we have a diameter of about 9.8 meters, so nothing as big as we were talking about earlier, but still fairly substantial, with the internal area divided into 10 or 11 bays. We don't really have enough information surviving from this site to know where people were sleeping, which bays might have been used for storage, or even where cooking and craft working was taking place. But one of my most fun finds is a whole pot was actually found under this part of the outer wall. And when I say pot, I'm talking a pot. It was huge. It was absolutely massive. It was quite a shock when I saw it for the first time. And so what we've hypothesized about this is it may well be a foundation deposit that was placed underneath the wall, perhaps to bring some good luck to the household. So the entranceway, that's it here, is located down in the southeast corner. And what I've done is I've put in the original quite beautiful sketch here of the original entranceway, and this is a photograph of it, so you can see both of these. And that entranceway there would have been accessed through a passage. The doorway had paving stones on the inside, and also this stone set up on edge here. So it could be even for preventing sand getting into your structure. Can you imagine how much you'd have to sweep if the wind blew all the sand in? Anyway, so that's just me thinking about my housework. So the internal features in this include 7 burnt areas. You can see there's quite a lot going on in here. These burnt areas have been suggested as hearths. They've also been suggested as a cooking pit. And my only colour photograph, exciting times, is this one here, which actually shows the cooking pit. And I don't know if you can see these layers of black and red and black, and so that's the burnt sand. We think that might be associated with the use of this cooking pit. There's also a storage tank, which is up here. Now, we're not saying that all of these features were used at the same time. We actually tried to distinguish different periods of use of these using radiocarbon dating, but unfortunately we just didn't have the samples or materials surviving to go through. We do have an oven here, but again we don't have any finds, photographs or anything other than what you see here, so it was difficult to really make much more of that. 9 what are referred to as holes were identified during excavation. Here's one here, very tiny, difficult to see, but anyway, trust me, that's a hole. There's another hole. There's 9 of them inside on the site entirely. It's thought that these could be one of 2 things. They could be post holes, so perhaps for the structure of the roof, or the other possibility is it could be like sites like Solace, which had loads of pits that were dug into the floor, and these were filled with burnt sheep bones. And so what these think are probably these ritualistic deposits that were put in before the floor. So it could be that, and we do have evidence from one of the holes of sheep bone within one of these holes, so that would suggest a slightly different function to being a post hole. As I mentioned, there is the suturin in the corner. That is the stairs for the suturin. And this one, only 6 of the stairs of the feature were excavated, but there were quite a few finds dating to the Middle Iron Age. These include pottery, there was animal bone, and there was even a copper alloy pin. Although the association between wheelhouse and suturin is not common, there are a number of other wheelhouses very close by area, including Solace and Kilfedder, which have these too. We also know, as I mentioned, the circular structure to the south, but it's a stone platform really is all that survives. There's some pottery in there, it dates to the Iron Age, but its relationship to the house isn't really very clear. So I'm going to move on to talk about the second wheelhouse. So this is the one that I showed you in the first picture that's just up to the north. This was located about 3 meters north of the southern wheelhouse, and the structural remains for this wheelhouse has survived to a much greater depth and a much greater jumble, as you can see there. With this, there is evidence for later modification and possible reuse of the site. Like with the first example, this part here is missing. Again, we could say it's to do with the bulldozing, or it could have been stones rubbed out for the later modifications which took place down in this corner here. So this wheelhouse here is slightly smaller than the southern example. It measures roughly about 8.8 meters. And the internal spacing here was divided into 12 bays, with the entrance also located in the southeast of, in the east of the structure. So this is your entranceway here. So not the southeast, but the east. And this one would have been, rather than having a passage entranceway, it had a bit of a forecourt, a little bit fancier. These are here curving on either side of the entrance passageway. So one of the more interesting finds from this site, which I just love, came from the entrance right underneath here. And that was a piece of human bone. It was a piece of human leg bone. And the osteoarchaeologist that had a look at this said, you know what, that's been broken in antiquity. So what it looks like is this has been carried there and has been deposited purposefully underneath this part, under this important threshold, this entrance and exit to your house. So really quite interesting, that one. Go on to the next slide. The plan doesn't really show any internal features, unfortunately. There is one hearth that was noticed from the south, not entirely sure where, but we know it's in the south of the building. And later correspondence between academic Ian Armitt and the excavator suggested this was at a very high level, so it was probably linked to squatter activity. We have this when we dig wheelhouses, that often they're reused maybe by shepherds in the area if they want to use shelter or things like that. So these are often reused. You often find kind of later hearths in there. However, when we started looking at the finds, we thought, wait a second, there's a whole bunch of Iron Age pottery that's coming from this hearth. So that got us thinking, maybe it wasn't later, maybe it was Iron Age in nature, but I will leave the jury out on that one. There was a second cell structure, so I'm going to go back slightly, in the southeast of the entrance, with it possibly being deliberately blocked. So down here is a secondary cell, so not part of the wheelhouse itself. Here you can see the quern, and what it's thought is that this entrance here was deliberately blocked at some point. Underneath this blocking was the quern and was the pottery. And so this has been interpreted by our find specialists as a possible ritual closing deposit, so marking the occasion when either one or other of those structures fell out of use. So also in here, so there you go, that's the blocked up entranceway, well obviously not blocked up anymore, and this is the quern stone underneath it. If you're interested, this here is a lintel stone, big lintel stone, which would have helped to hold up the roof, because most of the roof is called corbelling. It's like this kind of like stone that goes over the top of these cells with a kind of wooden in the middle, roof in the middle. And so to the north of this site, there was also possibly another third wheelhouse or also a R cell. So it had a slight curving. Sorry, when this is moving slowly, it's a little bit difficult to flick back and forward. But what we have here is evidence of a curving wall, which you can see coming out here, and they're here with a possible another pier here. And here is another blocked up entrance between the two. So we know that this feature must have been connected to the main wheelhouse at some point. And once it goes on to the next page, I'll tell you about that. Within the site archive, there is reference to a feature called the Long Wall, which is located in the southwest of the building. It isn't clear whether this is part of the additional cell or is something entirely. Construction looks slightly different, but the irregularity of the outer wall of the wheelhouse at this area suggests it could actually be part of the modification or reuse of this building. So here, this here, you can just see it. I played around with this to try and get a good contrast, but it hasn't quite worked. There's a blocking here of the entrance, and this is the long wall which came out at the bottom. So lots going on in that one, which is very difficult, 60 years later to try and interpret, but we're doing our best. So let's get on to the interesting stuff. What does this tell us about the people who are living at this site? A lot of academics who have looked at the number of people living in Iron Age roundhouses from all areas throughout Scotland. And what we know is it's likely to be a family unit, and it could possibly extend to extended family members and others. Wheelhouses are often published as single buildings, but what we have here is a possible community living out on this matter. We have radiocarbon dates, which we've taken from soil samples and from the bone, from antler finds, but also from the residue of the last meal that these people ate, which is still adhered to the inside of some of these pots, which is really quite amazing. So what this radiocarbon dates tell us is that both of these houses were occupied at the same time. So we had neighbours going on, it's brilliant. And probably were lived in for about 70 to 200 years, between the period 240, 200 BC up to AD 65. From the samples that were taken, we're also able to tell that these people were using local resources. Driftwood has been utilised both as a fuel source and a construction material, and we know this because the remains that survive have shipworm, which means that they've been out to sea. In addition to the shell remains, we also have bone from animals such as cattle, sheep, goats and deer, which gives us an insight into the diet of these people and what they were eating. The presence of a rotary kiln would also suggest that they were processing grain, perhaps for bread, although the function of this object will likely have changed when it became more ritual once it was placed in between the threshold between the house and the cell. The spindle walls show that, like many other Iron Age sites, we have small-scale textile production taking place. And the artefacts under the walls and possible foundation deposits and those closing deposits at the end of the life of the building give us some information about ritual and belief at that time, not to mention the presence of human remains under the important threshold of the entrance to wheelhouse number 2. So overall, all this evidence adds up to give us a glimpse of a previously unknown Iron Age community, one which has been confined to the shelves of museums and archives until now. The work of all the sites that were excavated during the rocket range were intended to be published as a single monograph, and unfortunately this didn't happen, with other sites such as the Caeaddach Mór and the Caeaddach Bheich being published separately in the 1960s. The dispersed archive of Brua Chatua had meant that its full potential wasn't really quite realised until it was realised by Historic Environment Scotland. What this project has shown is that with a bit of hard work, a bit of determination and the innovative application of archaeological science, you can get a really interesting insight into Iron Age life in the Western Isles. Another unexpected byproduct of my undertaking of this project, since I am a prehistorian, is an interest in the social history of these excavations and also the impact of the rocket range installation on the local people in the US. The National Archives, if you're interested, holds a lot of newspaper clippings that relate to this period in US history, which describes that almost 200 crofts were going to be destroyed by the building of this. And the construction was even taken to the Westminster Parliament to be debated. So what is the future for this project? I have loads of ideas about taking this forward, and if you guys have ideas, I would love to hear them. So my first action will be, I promise, to head of Archaeology and World Heritage, finish the publication. So I would like to get that out of the way. I'd like to create a poster, something to put into the airport so that they get an idea of the prehistory of the airport. After that, I'm kind of thinking maybe some geophysical survey of the remains. I'd really like to test my theory of community living. So I just wanted to say thank you and here are my acknowledgements. Thanks for listening.
Right, thank you very much for that, Lisa. And right, next I'd like to introduce you to Steve Farrer and Rachel Pickering, who will be talking about Clickhimin Rock, and they'll be giving you an idea of how we interpret Iron Age life in public.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming out tonight, and thanks Lisa for your fantastic talk. I think that kind of sets a really nice background introduction to what Steve and I are going to be talking about. So for the second half of tonight's talk, we're going to be hopefully giving you an insight into the work that we do, into the interpretation process and how we go from complex archaeological remains and upstanding monuments that we manage and care for to getting onto the on-site interpretation. So we're going to be focusing in particular on the process of creating a reconstruction illustration and the challenges that we face in doing this. Looking at a recent example of Clickhimin Broch, which is an Iron Age site in Shetland. So just to give you a bit of background information about the site, it's situated in Lerwick, which is the main port, Shetland's capital, if you like. And it's on a low promontory that extends into the Loch of Clickhimin. It's just on the outskirts of the town of Lerwick. Clickhimin is a complex and fascinating site that we think it was in use for around 1,000 years, from the late Bronze Age onwards. We call it Clickhimin Broch, but in reality it's actually a bit more complex than that. There's a lot more going on than just the broch. But for the most of tonight's talk, we will be talking about the broch structure itself. So at the centre of the site, just here, as you see the aerial view there, that's the broch tower. Surrounding it are a number of other structures that both pre- and post-date the broch itself. And the whole site, the whole promontory, is enclosed by a massive dry stone-built enclosure wall. There's also the iconic blockhouse or forework, which is just here. And I could probably spend the entire evening talking about that structure, but we don't have time, unfortunately. I will happily answer questions at the end or in the discussions later, though. So the broch itself belongs to the complex Atlantic roundhouse tradition. This is a kind of tradition of architecture in the Iron Age of dry stone circular structures. They date to around 500 to 100 BC, although that's quite hotly debated. And they're found across northern and western Scotland. The structures display quite distinct architectural features, such as galleries or cells between the walls. You can see here there's an inner and outer wall with spaces between them. Some of these spaces contain stairs, and we also have scarcement ledges that we think either supported roofs or upper floors. Moving on now to provide you a bit of the historical background to the site of Clickhimin. As I said, it's a complex site. It was recognised for its importance, its significance, from quite an early date. Quite a lot of the brochs that we have in our care attracted interest from visitors, explorers and surveyors from the 17th, 18th centuries onwards. And we have really good early records of this. The site was recorded by quite a skilled draftsman, Sir Henry Dryden, and there's a drawing just there of plans that he made of the site in 1855. Clickhimin was also one of the first sites to become a protected monument. It was scheduled in 1882 and it came into state care in 1888. There were quite a few early attempts to consolidate and conserve the site. Some of these, however, have caused problems in themselves. A lot of the early 19th and 20th century, early 20th century work to consolidate the site has actually led to kind of later confusion when we're trying to interpret the architectural features on the site. Clickhimin is also one of the few brochs that was extensively excavated. Almost the entire site has been excavated in the 1950s by the then Inspector of Ancient Monuments, J.R.C. Hamilton. The excavations themselves are particularly important as it was one of the first broch sites to be scientifically and stratigraphically excavated. Unfortunately, the excavations were right before the advent of radiocarbon dating, and so we don't have any scientific dates from the site. A lot of the ideas, the conclusions that Hamilton came to are also very much of their time, and there have been numerous reinterpretations of the site since his publication. And as our understanding of brochs and Iron Age sites in Scotland in general evolves, so too does our interpretation of the site at Clickhimin. So in 2015, there was a need highlighted to update our interpretation panels. Steve's going to go into this in more detail, but it's we have a rolling program of updating interpretation at our sites to make sure that they're current, up to date, and not too tatty. When we were presented with Clickhimin as needing new interpretation. We knew from the start that this was going to pose challenges. The complexity of the site and the number of unanswered questions we have about the site, the sequence, and the sequence of the different structures and how they would have looked. We knew that it was going to be quite a challenge to do. So the first step in the process was really for me to gather the information that we already have at the site, to work out what our current understanding of the site is and how this fits to the kind of wider framework of our understanding of Iron Age Scotland. And to highlight to Steve, who's producing the interpretation panel, the kind of errors and inaccuracies in the previous interpretation on the site.
So this is on the panel, and panels are the sort of workhorse of interpretation, of heritage interpretation. We use them in many of our sites. You're probably quite familiar with them. Clickhimin Broch is an unstaffed site. It's also open to the elements. There are no internal spaces, so the interpretation panel is ideally suited for communicating the stories we have to share. And we can pack a lot into a panel, but its space is still tight. Research suggests in an A1 panel like this, you can get about 250 words before you start putting visitors off reading any of it. We managed to sneak in a second panel, so we end up with an extra 120, which is amazing for a site. But it's a tiny amount considering how challenging and complex this site is. So the panel content was to draw on Rachel's work, and that would let us devise the stories that will help visitors get an understanding of how this site's changed, of what happened here, of how archaeologists have attempted to understand its past. I should add that those 250, 370 words also includes all the orientation for the visitor and visitor management messages. Everything that you need to make the visit really satisfying. So, reconstruction illustrations. Well, reconstructions are a very powerful form of interpretation, and our visitor surveys repeatedly tell us that people want to know how historic places may have looked. They really help visitors transport themselves into the distant past, where they don't have the specialist knowledge necessary to do so for themselves. And we use this approach with scenic displays, with models, even coming up virtual reality. But the static illustration is by far the most common form of reconstruction we use. It's one of the principal elements you'll see in many of our interpretation panels. We commission a lot of these every year. We draw on a pool of very talented and experienced reconstruction illustrators from across the UK. Each illustration is guided by our cultural heritage team and supported by specialists as appropriate. A great deal of work goes into each one of these. Well, I could tell you all about this, maybe I will later, but a number of academics, for instance, from Huntley Castle, fleshing out the interior from a lot of archive research. Okay, we'll get the hang of clicking this earlier. Clickhimin itself has a long heritage of reconstruction illustrations. In 1961, Alan Sorrell, who's a renowned illustrator, produced a series of reconstructions. These followed the excavation of the site the previous decade by his friend John Hamilton, and indeed Sorrell actually played a role in helping Hamilton conceptualise the various stages of development from what Hamilton has seen in the archaeological record. These illustrations carry Sorrell's assured style and authority, and also that characteristic hint of gloom that he gets into most of them. In 2009, Historic Scotland, as was, commissioned a new reconstruction illustration for the site. This was a more colourful, generic block illustration, and it was designed to be used at 8 sites across the country as part of a programme to replace a host of old and damaged panels. It worked well, but it wasn't universally well received. It led to a local newspaper article in which a couple of experts were very critical. Brian Smith, the Shetland-based Broch scholar, rejected the domesticity of our reconstruction, with its jolly curtains and cushions in the master bedroom. Brian concluded that the board is reductio ad absurdum of everything that had been written about Broch since 1980, I would scrap it and start again. Now, at the time, we noted that this was an artist's impression, and it was to encourage visitors to think about how our ancestors would have lived, and we were open to our suggestions. And indeed, during the process of putting the new panel together, we met Brian on site, and while he still disagrees with some key aspects of our interpretation, he was tremendously helpful. But clearly, reconstructing Broch is a contentious, perhaps slightly perilous endeavour. It requires a lot of care, a lot of thought to justify every decision. Okay, so the new image needed to help visitors turn passive ruins into a living structure full of activity. It needed to depict a famously dynamic and developing site in a single moment in time. And we chose that moment to be when the classic Broch Tower was in use, about 300 BC. We wanted that illustration to reflect the latest thinking, and we wanted it to engage visitors to think about the site's past glory, provoke a response, though perhaps not in the pages of the Shetland Times.
So, in producing a new reconstruction illustration and bringing the interpretation panel up to date, what are we trying to achieve? Usually we try and make sure that the reconstruction illustrations are, I guess, as close to what we think is authentic as possible. And we were trying to achieve that at Clickhimin. But as we've already touched upon, there are lots of different theories about Brochs, about how they would have looked and how they would have been used. And we've already faced criticism in the past for a kind of generic approach to Broch reconstructions. There are many and very different interpretations. Some people see them as purely defensive structures, as lookout towers. Some see them as high status residences, as status symbols that would have had a kind of dominant position in the landscape. And others see them as much more everyday sites that had a domestic function, that housed large family units of perhaps landowning farmer families. So in trying to create, thinking about these ideas and the many theories that have been proposed for Brochs and how they've looked, not just Clickhimin, but Brochs in general, and in beginning to weigh up these different theories, Steve and I decided to seek external advice for experts that could answer some of the questions we might have along the way, and to guide us through, provide advice throughout the reconstruction process. At an early stage in this process, I made contact with Dr. Tanya Romankiewicz, who is here tonight and can answer all the difficult questions that we have. And Tanya's carried out extensive research into Broch architecture, and in her PhD thesis has proposed a number of different theoretical reconstructions for Broch roofs. After initial discussions between Tanya, Steve and myself, we, thinking about how Clickhimin may have looked and functioned, it became clear to us that this was an opportunity to do something completely different with our reconstruction illustration, and that perhaps we could produce an illustration that would contribute something towards the academic debate. But at the same time, we also wanted to be honest about the complexities of the site and about the many uncertainties that we still have.
So, to help us with this, we selected an artist, David Simon, to undertake the work. Now, David is one of the most accomplished and rigorous reconstruction illustrators in the country working today. And he also, as Alan Sorrell did before, sports a standard issue artist beret. We'll further explore his work in due course. As I've already noted, reconstructions are contentious. They force you to address all sorts of issues, including the most disputed that maybe you wouldn't necessarily want to do. So regardless of academic disagreement, they demand a definite answer. What did that door look like? How high is that wall? What's that woman wearing? And you can only use well-placed smoke so much to cover the embarrassment of uncertainty. There's often nowhere to hide. So with Clickhimin Broch, that meant, among other things, addressing how the Broch was topped.
So, yeah, as Steve said, the main challenge is to address this question of how the Broch would have been roofed. It's a highly contentious subject and one that's been much debated. There's actually very little surviving evidence that can help us here in terms of archaeological or architectural evidence that can tell us if or even how or even if rocks were roofed. Musa, pictured here, is the most complete surviving example that we have of a rock. But even here, the uppermost wall sections don't survive, and the uppermost levels that we do have been largely reconstructed. We're not entirely sure of its original form. Furthermore, most of roofs would have been largely made of organic materials that simply haven't survived. There are a few quite limited lines of evidence that can provide us hints or clues as to how these structures might have been roofed. One of the main ones that's been used to argue for timber structures, internal structures or roofing, are the presence of internal post rings. Post holes on the floor of the central space of the box have been seen as indicative that there were structural timber posts that may have held up either a roof structure or upper floors. We also have charred timber remains from a small number of sites that have been excavated, such as Scalloway in Shetland and Dún Varvat in the Western Isles. Some people have also argued that the scarcement ledges that we see within a number of rocks supported low or perhaps lean-to roofs. So what other evidence we have? We can also look to vernacular buildings, much more recent structures that either constructed today or in the recent past, and perhaps use those as evidence for how people use local materials and resources to create roof structures. At Clickhimin, we also have the problem that a lot of the features, the architectural features, have been obscured by stone rubbing and by the insertion of the later wheelhouse. So the actual walls of the broch itself have been messed about with a lot since the time that the broch was in use. Here are a few previous reconstruction illustrations. The one on the left is quite a generic, traditional one. The other two shown here are previous interpretations of how Clickhimin may or may not have been roofed. So there are a number of different theories. The first one here shows this kind of lean-to or partial roof structure that may have existed at Clickhimin, and this is based on an idea initially proposed in the 1930s by Curl, and it's based on evidence of the internal post holes that he found when he excavated Dún Troddenbroch. As you can see, there's kind of a circular arrangement of structural timbers that would have held a kind of gallery or range of buildings around the interior of the broch, and it would have just had a low roof that only kind of covered that range of structures, and the roof would have sloped inwards, resting on the scarcement ledge. Other suggestions, there have been suggestions that brochs may have had parapet walkways. This idea is in keeping with kind of more Victorian ideas that these were purely defensive structures. And of course, there's the kind of traditional interpretation of how a broch would have been roofed, this large conical roof supported by large structural timbers. All of these different theories have their own merits and their own problems. One of the main issues that we have with this widely accepted and traditional interpretation of how a broch would have been roofed for the Clickhimin site and for Shetland brochs in general is that would there have been the availability of timber needed to build these structures and to maintain them? This is a question that's come up again and again. A lot of brochs are built in largely treeless landscapes, so where would they have got the timber from that they would have needed to create such roofs and upper floor structures as pictured in the kind of traditional reconstruction? So now, in terms of producing the on-site illustration, we're aware of all these many and varied different theories for how a broch might have been roofed. But as Steve has already said, we have a very limited number of words, and we only have 2 panels, one reconstruction illustration. So what did we decide to go with? And why did we decide that we were going to break away from the generic and traditional Broch reconstruction image? Well, as I've already said, we hoped that we could do something different at Clickhimin and that we could perhaps contribute towards academic debate. After many discussions, we eventually decided to go with this grid shell roof design. It's one of the ideas that's proposed in Tanya's thesis. And it's also based on architectural and archaeological evidence, both from Clickhimin and from a number of other Broch sites. This design takes into account regional factors such as the climate in Shetland, as well as evidence from vernacular buildings in the Western and Northern Isles. It's quite a controversial idea, and it's certainly not one that has been presented in terms of reconstruction illustrations in the public before. But it's also one that really addresses the problems of structural timbers and the availability of timber. It's also much more flexible kind of roof structure. It's quite lightweight, and we suggest that the grid shell would have been made of willow, which we know from the excavations was there at Clickhimin. It also would have been covered with turf or heather thatch. So in adopting this design, we move away from a generic one-size-fits-all reconstruction to move towards one that takes into account factors specific to the site of Clickhimin itself.
So back to David Simon. David starts, he has a wonderful way of working. He immerses himself in the subject. He confidently interrogates every expert he can find, and then pulls together the sites, excavation plans, elevations, and core ideas to provide himself with a starting place. And then he literally rebuilds the monument from pizza boxes, cereal packets, and so on. His model of Clickhimin Broch is here. You may have seen it next door. You can have a look at it afterwards. We rescued it from the fate that befalls most of David's models, which is the conservation nightmare of his compost bin. He uses the model to identify the best angles within our brief. So we wanted to relate to where our panel will be, and to get the whole structure sort of fixed in his head. You'll notice the first structure here, of course, has got a conical roof. From the model, he then moves to the sketches, and these sketches are slightly later in the process as discussions with the design team, includes Tanya, Rachel, myself and David, as the discussions developed. So each of David's drafts posed us new questions to which we had to provide answers. The roof here is now a dome, so what was it made from? How did it actually sit over the cavity walls? How was it held down? And over the weeks, David's sketches evolved as these key details were agreed. Not necessarily correct, where evidence was lacking, but certainly discussed and justified. And ultimately, once the final draft was agreed, David could paint the final version. This fabulous full-colour artwork arrived in due course, and it constitutes, I think, a really powerful and unique glimpse of how Clickhimin Broch may once have been. And there are so many details to explore here. The pigs or grice down just outside the Broch, the clay on the walls of the upper chamber. There's a lot to interrogate here. But, of course, most prominent of all, perhaps, is the roof. That illustration now dominates the panel that we installed on site 11 months ago. We cover all sorts of stories in the panel, within our 250 words. The forework, the rock cut footprints, we haven't mentioned them, painted pebbles, bone dice found on the site, and the challenges of understanding the site. And as to the illustration, we were open and honest about its status. And we include the following caveat, which I've never included any caveat quite so thorough as this, but we say that the turf-covered willow grid shell roof is conjecture inspired by local domestic architecture. Scant evidence survives as to how the Broch was capped. It is even possible that it never had a roof.
Now, as Steve said here, we used a never used word before on an interpretation panel for the one at Clickhimin, the word conjectural. We often use the term artist's impression, but I think most people would agree that when you go to visit a site and you see a reconstruction illustration, you generally accept it as an authentic image of how the site once looked. Here at Clickhimin, we wanted to actually address the fact that there are so many uncertainties, but this is the best we could make of the evidence we have at the moment, and we wanted, as I've said before, to contribute to the academic debate about how Brock's would have been roofed. What we really wanted to achieve with the reconstruction illustration at Clickhimin was to get people thinking about this problem of how they might have been roofed, how they would have looked, and to get people questioning this and talking about the site. And I'll leave you to decide whether we've been successful in that and how accurate you think the illustration may or may not be. But for my closing thoughts, I wanted to leave you with this screen grab of what happened when the image was leaked on a Facebook page. So David Simon's illustration was posted on the Caithness Brock Project page on Facebook prior to the interpretation panel going onto the site. And as you can see from a selection of the comments that I've quoted here, from the comments that were left on the page, there was a lot of debate going on, and the comments and questions and queries about the reconstruction illustration actually perfectly encapsulate a lot of the discussions that we had between Steve, Tanya, David and I when we were producing the illustration. And people are really asking the questions that we hoped they would and thinking about the site in the ways that we hoped they would. So we found this a really promising reaction. And so far there haven't been any further headlines, news headlines. So we hope that we can write that off as a success. And finally, I would just really like to thank Tanya and David for all the effort that they put into the process of creating this reconstruction illustration. There were really invaluable advice and support from Tanya throughout the process, and an amazing attention to detail, and David asked questions that we'd never even thought about when we were putting this illustration together. So I can't thank them enough for the help throughout the process that we had from them. And thank you all for listening to our talk. We'll see you.
Thank you.